Отныне наступает новая полоса в истории России.
Karl Marx was born in Prussia in 1818. An analysis of his private life reveals why he was attracted to a communist ideology. During his childhood, for example, his family converted to Protestantism, feeling that it was the most free-thinking religion that broke from the main social structure. Marx's rebelliousness and refusal to conform followed him throughout his life. In university, he was quite the animal, being arrested multiple times and even getting in a duel. His educators, even in high school, were liberal-minded, and at university he joined a radical group that spent its time criticizing the grand narratives of the time, namely religion and politics. Marx had a secret engagement to a woman 4 years older than him and never settled down, instead opting to be thrown out of multiple countries for his radicalism. He even had the stereotypical disappointed dad who disapproved of his lifestyle. To top it all off, Marx barely worked, opting instead to live off of his rich friend Friedrich Engels, while he wrote the works that would make him famous. Marx wrote his most famous work, the Communist Manifesto, in 1848, a very troubling year for Europe. Within the year, various insurrections across the continent, from France to the Habsburg Empire to Ireland, caused instability as liberal ideas struggled with conservative establishments. While these revolts were mostly failures and led to a doubling down on conservative policy, the effect of Marx's work would be a quiet success, the full consequences of which would not be realized until the next century. But what was so radical about Marx's philosophy of communism? Perhaps the most alarming aspect of the ideology was the call for overthrow of the current institutions. The monetary system and economy, religions, private property, even political systems were considered evils by the philosophy and were to be dispensed with. In his head, these systems were created for keeping the powerful in power while allowing them to exploit the labor of others and repress them. Marx prophesied that the working class would overthrow the bourgeoisie and usher in the communist utopia. In an ideal communist society, there would be no money, no one would have power over others, and society would be improved through a secular adherence rather than religious teachings. The Communist Manifesto complemented Marx's other work, Das Kapital, which was a scathing criticism of capitalism, as well as laying out his materialist philosophy and conflict theory. Marx's most powerful critique of capitalism was that it led to inequality, and those who were working were being exploited by the rich to make them richer. Marx also theorized that the progression of history was driven by class warfare, where the oppressors and oppressed struggled for dominance. His materialist philosophy laid out that the history books were flawed, since everyone perceived history differently depending on their economic status. These ideas from Das Kapital would come to bear to justify the communist ideology, justifying an overthrow of capitalism due to the inequality it produced, and a liquidation of the grand narratives of Western culture on the grounds that they were created by the privileged to maintain power. The communist philosophy was mostly relegated to intellectual circles for the next 69 years, until a Russian revolutionary, Vladimir Lenin, led an overthrow of the Tsardom in Russia and instituted the first communist regime, forever changing the world. Lenin would spark a bloody civil war in the country, and his successors would see the USSR through the most tumultuous times of world history, with genocide, war, and nuclear weapons characterizing the regime's existence. But communism was not just relegated to Russia. In 1949, the Communist Party came to power in China after another brutal civil war. Under Mao Zedong, China would undergo massive economic and cultural change, transforming the country into the modern day's up-and-coming superpower, but not before seeing Mao crowned as history's worst murderer. In Cambodia, Pol Pot came to power with his Khmer Rouge militia in 1975. The Khmer Rouge ran torture prisons and execution camps, and in 4 years, Pol Pot killed a quarter of his country's population. Communism found its way to various other countries as well, most notably Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea. 23 countries in total have been communist at one point, with 5 remaining as such to this day. These countries spanned 4 continents, and many cultures with a total body count as high as 110 million people in less than a century. The loss of human life was not the only thing that made communism a massive event in world history. The post-war world order was almost entirely dependent on the birth of communism. Without the power of the USSR, without Stalin's willingness to kill countless millions of his own people, civilians and soldiers alike, the outcome of World War II may have been much different. At the end of the war, the Soviet occupation of the Eastern Bloc led to a standoff between East and West. For 44 years, the major powers of the world were ready to destroy each other at the drop of a hat, and the entire world with them. The superpowers of Russia and China emerged, largely as a result of the brutal effort by these countries to become dominant. Marxist philosophies also laid the foundation for postmodernism and modern oppressor-oppressed identity politics. Despite the massive failure of his ideas, Marx's philosophy lives on, with 20% of modern humanities professors being Marxist, outnumbering conservatives by 4-fold. After the Cold War, every communist country came out worse than it otherwise would have, and recovery has only been possible through the exploitation of Marx's antithesis, capitalism. This is the start of a series I hope to do on communist revolutions throughout history. Admittedly, that intro was quite bleak and focused more so on the loss of human life than the other more important political and social ramifications of communism. But through this series, I hope to take a more nuanced take on the powerful ideology without falling into the pitfalls that the right and the left often fall into when discussing the ideology. I don't want to focus on the ideas of communism as much, so much as its history, or more accurately, how it changed history. Let me know what you guys think of the series and this intro I've made for it, and also don't forget to hit the subscribe button and notification bell. YouTube doesn't like content that looks at the darker sides of history, so making sure you get notified when I post helps you see my content and helps the channel out as well. Communism and its history is one of the most important things that someone can learn about, and it is often overshadowed by other 20th century events like World War II or the Holocaust. Even when communism is looked at, it usually tends to be in the context of the Cold War and its interaction with the West. This series is different, as I want to look at how communism developed historically and how it worked within the given areas that regimes had power or tried to take it. Many people tend to see communism in either one of two lights, and while both viewpoints have some validity, neither are totally right. One of these viewpoints tends to be found on the left wing of the spectrum, and this is the view that communism works in theory but hasn't been executed properly. I call this the "that wasn't real communism" argument, and while it has something to be said for it, it's mostly wrong. While it's true that no country has followed Marx's prescriptions to the letter, it is also true that doing so is probably impossible. To make an analogy, someone can say that a special technique can help you breathe underwater, has never been properly executed, but it ignores the fact that it is just impossible to breathe underwater in the first place. The other view, which tends to be found on the right, tends to lump everything even remotely close to big government or progressive thought in with communism itself. I call this the "sounds like communist propaganda to me" view. This view finds some validity in that communist regimes historically will tone down their message, sometimes in order to work within the system, but then become more radical once they have more power. The blind spot of this view, however, is that it doesn't take into account the nuance found in progressive ideologies. Not only is there lots of diversity within communist thought, but socialist thought is also largely separate, and the two factions have clashed violently against each other. The accusation of things like welfare being communist can often have an association bias and sound like the Hitler had a dog argument. The logic being Hitler had a dog, therefore anyone who has a dog is like Hitler. In short, both of these views need some correction, and I believe that this correction can be found by examining the historical record of communism from its inception as a manifesto to its execution by world superpowers. The next video in this series is going to look at Karl Marx. I talked about him a bit in this video, but the next one is going to go more in depth, taking a look at his personal life, the world he lived in, and his ideas and writings, especially the Communist Manifesto. From there, I'm going to look at the various communist revolutions around the world and their impact, even if they weren't successful. The first one I'm going to look at is the Russian Revolution, which took place in 1917 and resulted in one of the bloodiest wars the world had ever seen, and the birth of the first communist nation. From there, I'll try to go in chronological order, starting with a series of failed communist uprisings in Central Europe. Mongolia and China are next, followed by a slew of others as well as the post-war Eastern Bloc countries. This series will continue through all the revolutions, both well-known and obscure, and end with a look at the 5 communist countries that still exist today and where they stand now. So thanks for watching this video, everyone. I'm currently going into final season at school, so hopefully in about a month I'll be making better and more consistent content. I'm currently rereading the Communist Manifesto as well in preparation for the next video in this series, so hopefully I can give a good summation of the ideas of Marx and find good excerpts and quotes instead of putting words in his mouth. Anyways, that's it for this video. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to get notified when I release these videos, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.